The next section is about how to make change happen. And we're going to hear from Christine Cooper, Dougie Peedle, and Craig DL. We'll start with Christine. Christine Cooper is a professor of accounting at Edinburgh University, the co-editor of Critical Perspectives on Accounting. Her research is concerned with the economic, political, and social impact of accounting on our everyday lives. This has produced publications in diverse social arenas, including social and environmental accounting, gender, privatization, de-skilling of accountants and bookkeepers, insolvency, taxation, accountability, and the history of Anglo-Americans in the apartheid era. She's currently working on projects concerned with government accountability and prisons. She holds a PhD from the University of Strathclyde and a master's degree from the London School of Economics. And as you can tell, she's also given me a very thorough bio, which is amazing. Thank you so much. Are we able to spotlight Christine and bring her in?
Thank you so much. I could just say that in the lunchtime, my screen sharing was disabled. So I don't know if someone could enable it, and I'll share my slides.
Yeah, Ryan has to do that as host.
Oh, that's lovely. That's great. Thank you. Okay. Okay, right. So first of all, I'd just like to thank everyone, enormously for asking me to this. Just so there's, I suppose there's two things that I should say. First one is, yeah, as an accountant and a kind of like academic accountant, I'm feeling a little bit like an outsider to this, which is probably kind of true. And secondly, I know that most people find accounting, the idea of accounting even, completely boring. So I'm not going to talk for very long, and I'm hoping that what I'm going to say is going to be of interest, like, to two parts of what happened earlier in this amazing event. The first one is kind of like concerned with what tools, do we need for economic transformation. I'm going to talk a little bit about accounting's role in that. And I'm also going to talk a tiny bit as well about the kind of the finance requirements that were kind of dealt with, I think, at the end of Matthew's talk. Okay, so I thought I'd just start by talking about, I suppose, like the other side of, I don't know, of kind of circular economics, really to say, and I think this is one of the joys of being old, is that, like, since I've been at university, I've seen neoliberal ideas develop. Unfortunately, I've seen some kind of other economic ideas develop. But I have to say that in accounting and finance, sadly, the dominant ideas are still very much the very kind of like, they're not that old-fashioned, because they're really not that old in some ways, ideas that have been developed under neoliberalism. And it's, I suppose, the other thing I would say is that people that have kind of like, that really, believe in very right-wing economics, they sponsored universities and think tanks and use those strategically, really. And they've been so successful in this to change the kind of like the way that people think about the economy, so that it's now deeply kind of ingrained. And I completely agree that, of course, there are new economic ideas, but I think still, if you talk to most people on the street about like doing new initiatives, one of the first things that they say is, look, can we afford it? So we've definitely got a job of work to be done to kind of unpick those economic ideas. And they have become incredibly embedded in the accounting profession. And so when I was studying, this is showing my age, when I was at business school, which was from 1977 to 1981, I was actually told, as if this was like some kind of gospel law, that the duty of a company is to maximize its profits. And of course, people might recognize the man on the right. This is our friend Milton Friedman, and that was very much his kind of line about business. And of course, there were lots of other ideas linked to that. So we should have very small or no government, that markets are completely the best allocator of the society's resources, that the value of a company is reflected in its stock market price. So if you want to know, let's say a company's issued 100 shares and they're £1 each, then the value of a company is £100. And if the share price goes up to £1.50, then the value of the company goes up to £150. And alongside that, there was a new dominant form of economics that was kind of like gradually, well, I think wasn't gradually, it was like really fought for, that has gradually kind of came to become the dominant ideas really that inform both accounting and finance and many other business school subjects. Okay, so the interesting thing for me, I suppose, as an accountant, is that financial economics is really just concerned with how to price things like shares or, you know, long-term loans, bonds, options. This is, I've just put here this option pricing formula. And all of those kind of financial economic ideas were not really exclusively, or, you know, perhaps less in economics departments. They were actually really built in accounting and finance departments. So those kind of ideas, as I say, that, you know, they were around when I was a student, but actually they've kind of developed since then. These are ideas that have been taught to business students that are likely to become accountants and go into the finance industry now for 2 generations. Okay, in terms of, and it's really interesting because we're interested in tools of economic transformation. In terms of being a tool of economic transformation, these financial models actually were incredibly successful. So I've put here, this is a picture of Donald Mackenzie, who's an academic at Edinburgh University, and he wrote this amazing book called An Engine, Not a Camera. So while accounting and that uses these kind of financial economic models says, you know, that it's neutral and it's just reflecting reality, it's kind of like a camera then, just to, you know, give people to make an organization more transparent. It's actually, no, it's much more than that. They actually became engines that actually kind of drove the economy. And to some extent, it's completely possible to argue that, I've just put up the formula for option pricing. These are kind of like not even real assets. And this is, you know, these assets, you know, it was like a huge market and they were traded. Lots of banks bought them and sold them. And this was actually the kind of like the part of the financial crisis that we had in 2008. So, you know, yeah, these are, I suppose, I don't know that we can learn lessons from this, but perhaps we could. Okay, so after this idea that a company should maximize its profits, this actually changed. And even in the 1980s, and definitely it became kind of mantra by 2000, that really what we should do is maximize like the economic value of a company. So basically maximize its share price. And these two people, the guy at the top is Michael Jensen and the guy at the bottom is William Meckling. And they wrote several papers actually in the 1980s that, you know, gradually kind of like got traction, and I think are probably the most cited papers in finance and accounting probably across the world. And what they kind of fed into was this shareholder value movement that said that, you know, people, you're maximizing social welfare if you maximize the share price. One of the things that these two guys actually argued for is, look, you know, in order to get companies to kind of buy into this, we need to incentivize them. And this is where executive pay now in the 21st century, a big proportion of it is actually given to the executives in terms of shares. And I understand, yeah, that, you know, I'm not, you know, this isn't like completely, you know, business is always, you know, completely bad. But yeah, so I know that there are some executive contracts now that have started to try and put environmental and, you know, other kind of sustainable goals into executive contracts. But these are very, very difficult things to measure. And often it's to do with reporting. So do you report this? Do you report that? Do you report something else? And then you can tick those boxes and get your bonus for worrying about the environment. But, you know, the dominant form of like concern of most CEOs and, you know, their boards is not the environment. It's to do with making the share price as high as possible. So most accounting research, and I'm really talking about mainstream research here. There are other really, wonderful kind of areas of accounting research, but the dominant form of research that goes on across the world kind of says, look, okay, so we've got these models. So you get these guys that are really good at econometrics, and they say, let's have a look at, whether a share price moves if they get this kind of new information. So they'll look at any database that they've got. And they have started to look at emissions. They've started to look at CSR reporting. They've started to look at environmental reporting, and they kind of say, is there a correlation between like this kind of information and whether this actually impacts on the share price? Because their sole concentration is on what investors want and what's happening to the share price. Yeah, so there's now this kind of like emerging new area, now that there are more databases about companies' environmental activities, and it's basically only concerned with shareholder value maximization. So does this information enable the share price to change? And basically, if the share price doesn't change, there could be some really good information, but that's kind of then going to be, considered to be worthless and a waste of money. And if you talk to these guys, it's not, of course, everyone's concerned really about global warming. What they say is, they say that, yeah, the most polluting companies will be punished by falling share prices. There's no evidence, by the way, most of these models were introduced, but no kind of like, there was no empirical work to kind of back them up. But these guys say, yeah, so everyone cares about the environment, so polluting companies will be punished, their share prices will fall, and this will mean that investment is going to be directed towards the least polluting companies. Okay, there's lots and lots of problems with this argument. Firstly, when people or an institution, or pension funds or whatever, buy and sell shares or bonds or, these kind of financial instruments, the company doesn't receive any money from that investment. So if I decide I'm going to go and buy BP shares, I will go to a stockbroker and I will buy someone else's shares. None of the money that the money that I pay will go to the person that's selling them, and none of that will go to the company. The other thing I should say, and this is something that people really haven't researched enough, is the private equity market is booming. And private equity is investors that kind of act as a bank. So they go to companies that need money and they secure it, they kind of like, they take mortgages kind of as it were on their assets and loan them money. But this is completely unregulated. So this whole concentration in accounting and finance research on, let's say, stock markets is missing now a big part of the economy. And what's really going to make a share price fall is if governments pass legislation that actually might cost a company money. And basically, there's so much research that says that there's a disconnect between share prices and what's really going on in the real economy. And even if you did believe that, eventually investment is going to go to green kind of initiatives, how long is that going to take? Okay, so very recently, the accounting profession, with this very kind of narrow investor focus, have moved into worrying about the environment. So I've put this IIFRS. IIFRS are the organisation that are in charge of the body that sets accounting standards, so how accounting is kind of done throughout the whole world. And if you look at their mission statement, our mission is to develop IIFRS standards that bring transparency, accountability, and efficiency to financial markets around the world. And then there's this link to because they're worried about financial markets. Yeah, our work serves the public interest by fostering trust, growth, and long-term financial stability in the global economy. But basically, they're worried about information for investors to make money. And they are financed. I just kind of like that. I snipped this from their annual report. I don't know if this is probably too small to see, but they're in some ways they are very transparent. But they do say they're major donors, and I mean almost £2.5 million comes from the big four accounting firms. So this is the people that set accounting standards that kind of really do impact on people's lives. This is a non-democratic organisation that receives its funding from big business. Okay, so they've set this new consultation paper to form a new sustainability standards board. I think I'm talking too long. I'm going to skip that because, oh no, perhaps I should just go back. I know I'm talking too long. So they've got this thing called double materiality. And basically, so what they mean by that is that they're concerned with information that's going to impact on the share price. And they do actually admit, this is number 48, if you could read it, some stakeholders are interested in developing standards referring to the impact of the reporting entity or the company on the wider environment. But they're not interested in that. So that's the only kind of recognition in this whole document that we need to worry about measuring a company's impact on the environment. Okay, so I've kind of said that. There's other initiatives and they're all exactly the same. Okay, so the other materiality is who should, and I know this is part of the discussion here, who should actually set these standards, who should set the framework for reporting. And, I really don't, I'm not saying that accountants couldn't be involved in this, but their mindset at the moment probably is going to, make that kind of a tough call. And I think that, there may be some organizations that are, that are going to produce stuff that perhaps we do want. And I'm not saying that, it's going to be highly polluting, but we may have to decide where, which products and which, I don't know, things we kind of want. So I think if we're going to set any kind of standards for a better world, for workers' rights and for, creating the things that society really needs, we need someone that understands the big picture. And I just thought I'd just tell, just to remind people, probably most people know this story, but in terms of incentives, so in the 1970s, the US, this is Ford, the US kind of car industry was under threat from smaller, faster Japanese, European cars. So they had this very aggressive target that they were going to make a car that wouldn't cost a penny over $2,000, and they wanted it kind of everything done and in production within 25 months. And one of the things that they found out that if there was a rear collision, this is the bottom picture, that the whole car could blow up, and that design fault could actually be fixed by introducing a $11 to $13 shield behind the, I don't know, just in the back of the car. And the cost of that to the company was $113 million. But they worked out that the number of people that would actually die in that collision and the payouts that they would probably have to pay to them only came to $49 million. So they decided not to go ahead with it. And this was at a time really before shareholder value maximization really kind of came into its own. I'm going to put this here, this is if you could just Google it, this is a YouTube clip there's a discussion between Milton Friedman and someone who's asking him about this Ford Pinto case, and what he says is incredibly interesting. Okay, thank you.
Christine, thank you so much. Feel free to put that link in the chat. That would be good homework for people to go away and watch. And just to say as well, as someone who isn't an economist, I too sometimes feel like an outsider in spaces like this. I know you opened with that, and the reality is, though, we need more people who aren't economists shaping the economy and what that looks like, and that element of participation which has been feeding in throughout the day has just fed in through what you've shared there as well. In the interest of time, I won't do much more of a summary of that, but Christine, that was compelling and fantastic. Thank you so much. Let's move on to our next speaker now, who is Dougie Peedle. Dougie is currently the head of policy at the Scottish Wildlife Trust and also has a number of other roles as a member of Aberdeen City Council's Economic Policy Panel, the Economist member of the UK Government's Armed Forces Pay Review Body, and as an economic associate for Pro Bono Economics. Prior to joining the Trust, Dougie was Chief Economic Advisor to the Jersey Government, having held a number of economist roles in London before that. So, Dougie, over to you.
Good afternoon. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, yeah, fine.
Yeah, great. It's good timing to hand over to an economist, I think, after a previous presentation. I want to be relatively quick and just give you some thoughts on how we see the key ingredients are for making change happen. And I'll focus briefly on the framework. We've had lots of discussion around that already, but some important points I think to make beyond that. Also, a little discussion around metrics and, quite importantly, focus on some of the actions that are required. In terms of the overall framework, Scottish Government have actually already had the advice from their own independent advisory group on economic recovery to adopt the four capitals approach, the four capitals being environmental, community, business and people related, all fundamental pillars for well-being in the economy. Scottish Government appear to have accepted that advice, so it'll be interesting to see when this new strategy comes forward, to what extent does it actually take that fully on board. I'll be surprised if they go as far as their own advisory group was suggesting, but we'll just have to wait and see. If they want to know how it's done, they can look quite closely to one of their partners within the Wellbeing Governments Alliance. New Zealand, a lot has been said about what's been going on in New Zealand with their living standards framework. And quite quickly, if you take a look at that, you can see that it focuses on, in the Our Future element, on an assessment of the four capitals and how they're all performing. On the natural capital side, you can actually drill down into that detail, and it tells you, gives you biodiversity indicators as being core part of that economic strategy and that economic approach. And really important, and this is, I think, we'll hear about the Scottish Government's National Performance Framework, but critical with this framework is that it actually does drive decisions. And New Zealand have actually done wellbeing budgets on the basis of this framework, and you're actually seeing it feeding through into actual policy decisions as well, and not just a dashboard for monitoring things. If you actually, as I say, go into that detail, there is information on the situation regarding biodiversity and extinction rates, and I think that ties very nicely in with the conclusions of an eminent report from Professor Dasgupta on the economics of biodiversity, which was published earlier this year, and its headline finding being that the simple truth that our economies are bedded within nature. It's not that they're separate or it's something different, that actually, if you want to see a sustainable economy, then you've got to be managing biodiversity in your biosphere at the same time. That's all well and good, but when you start to dig a little bit deeper and think, okay, how are we actually performing in Scotland on these key indicators? Well, first off, looking at nature in Scotland, please, if you haven't seen it already, please take a look at the State of Nature report in Scotland. I can't do it service in the time that I've got, but you can just take a look at these charts and notice that they're all pointing downwards, whether that's looking at the abundance of nature or the overall distribution of nature. All the long-term trend is down and the short-term trend is a continuation of that. You might think, well, that's happening in a lot of countries at the moment and it's an international challenge, which it is, but where does it actually leave us in Scotland? Well, this is an internationally recognised indicator of biodiversity intactness, looking how the abundance of nature has changed relative to a baseline kind of pre-modern times. You might take away from this that it looks quite encouraging that the UK is number 12 in that list in the top half of the chart, but that's 12th from bottom out of 240 countries. Scotland itself is 28th from bottom, which I think puts it about 212. Now, that to me is a pretty dire performance. I'm a bit of a football anorak and I'm trying to put it in a football context. The Scotland national team at the moment, a lot of people not happy with how we're performing on the men or ladies side, but 45th out of 210 on the men's side and 22nd and of about 180, I think, on the women's side. So our football team is actually performing much better compared to our biodiversity performance. If we were actually at the same level in football as we are at biodiversity, you'd find that we were down about 185.5. So that would be ranked just below Djibouti and just above Laos. Not a comment on those as footballing nations, but I could imagine the uproar if Scotland's national team was performing at that level. Why are we not seeing the same sort of uproar about our biodiversity performance? If we just briefly touch on natural capital as well, again, we've got metrics on natural capital. We've got a lot of information. Nature Scott produced the Natural Capital Index. We've now got natural capital accounts from Scottish Government, all giving us a wealth of information on the situation regarding natural capital. But you have to dig a little bit deeper to find Nature Scott's long-term assessment on natural capital in Scotland, which is that in 1990, it was just about 20% below what it was in 1950. So a long-term trend there of a declining our natural capital. You can argue lots of pros and cons about natural capital accounting, but I think it's telling us a very similar picture. If you've seen those trends in biodiversity, you're seeing a key pillar to your well-being deteriorating, and there's not really been any significant improvement since. So in terms of making change happen, knowing that, understanding the metrics, Matthew, I think, touched on this earlier on, the need to get legally binding nature targets in place. We can't give the emphasis and priority to this important part of our economy without actually having some legally binding targets. It's helped galvanise things on the climate side, but a real need to have some equity there in terms of how we look at biodiversity. Great that Scottish Government appear to be moving in that direction, not as encouraging when you hear that it won't take place until the introduction of a natural environment bill towards the end of this Parliament. Also, in terms of alongside that nature targets, what about natural capital? Previous economic strategies spoke about protecting and enhancing natural capital, clearly hasn't happened. What do we need going forward? Well, again, the advisory group on economic recovery was quite clear. Let's aim to leave natural capital in a better state for the next generation, something again that we could focus on. But it's not just about targets, it's about the action. So what can we actually do to turn that curve and actually improve things? Well, again, Dasgupta was quite clear that given the impact we're having on biodiversity, the fact that our demands on biodiversity are far greater than its ability to supply them, we need to look at nature-based solutions. I won't go into detail right now on nature-based solutions, but quite clearly, I think everybody's familiar with nature's capability to provide solutions to a lot of society's problems, whether that's health, whether that's climate change, whether that's actually the economy and jobs overall as well. And a real need to pick up our game and really improve on what we're doing on nature-based solutions. So step two would really be about committing significant funds to investing in nature-based solutions, and quite critically for Scotland, getting beyond the current approach, which seems to focus very much on, yes, a very positive commitment to investment in peatlands, also high-level forestry targets, but seem to be focused primarily on a non-native species. How can we get beyond that in terms of focusing on native woodland? And quite critically, how can we focus on the urban environment, making sure that nature-based solutions can deliver problems in help address the problems in our cities? And quite fundamentally, also, how can we harness the marine environment to really contribute to those goals and make sure that we remove the pressures on the marine environment? Also, in terms of what Dasgupta said, and very relevant for where we are in Scotland at the moment, is just how financial subsidies that damage nature far outweigh the financial subsidies that actually benefit nature. That's at the global level, but we can see the same thing in Scotland. 600 million worth of subsidies there being used to support agriculture at the moment. And yes, there is a commitment to look at least reforming half of that going forward, but we need to understand what that's going to be and really look at the time frame as well. So we really need to accelerate the planned change in agricultural payments going forward. Also, in terms of the way we look at habitats at the moment, land use is one of the big drivers of biodiversity loss, and we've got very much a fragmented landscape. Lots of scientific evidence to show that if we can actually connect that landscape up in a variety of different ways, we can really improve the biodiversity outcomes and really improve the value of the sites that we have for nature at the moment as well. Again, Scottish Government starting to say the right thing in terms of looking at local nature networks for every local authority over the course of this Parliament. We'd really like to make sure that they really focus on ecological coherence, and also that at the national level, the sum of the parts come up to a strategic approach that really delivers for addressing the biodiversity and climate crisis together. Also, in terms of enhanced decision making, lots of discussion earlier on about community involvement. Well, the Scottish Land Commission were quite clear that we should be introducing regional land use partnerships in Scotland to help with decision making around land use at the regional level, particularly managing natural capital at the regional level. It's positive in terms that that's been taken forward by government in the programme for government. Just slight concern about some of the wording around it. Should these pilots prove successful, we will develop plans for a second phase from 2023. I think it should be a case of we are developing plans for a second phase and that we learn from those pilots. A little bit concerned there that they're not getting the funding they require to actually be successful. So certainly look at how we can expedite the rollout of regional land use partnerships going forward, and again, move more quickly than is currently planned. In terms of another key area, money matters, as I'm sure we all know. Das Gupta in the top left there was very clear about how we can focus on making sure finance at the international level really works for biodiversity. Ourselves, in partnership with CEPA, produced the £1 Billion Challenge, a roadmap to 9 new forms of conservation finance, again, which can help bring and unlock new finance for nature's recoveries. There's also a whole host of areas where we can potentially develop, look at the role, I think Matthew mentioned it earlier, of the infrastructure investment plan. Great that natural infrastructure is now included in that, but it's about time that it got its fair share of funding for infrastructure investment. Also looking at the role of the Scottish National Investment Bank. We probably do have to think about tax as well. UK Climate Change Committee have been clear on that. And also, you know, where can we be smarter, and new facilities such as those looking at investment readiness, how we get projects together to be ready for investment. How can we really you know, make sure that that is funded, and there's a clear role, I think, for government in that area. So if we can unlock those new methods of conservation finance, then we're starting to hit the right notes. It's interesting, the report out this week from the 4 nature agencies across the UK. One of the quotes I focused in on there was they're saying nature recovery is within our grasp. We know what to do and how to do it. The time is to act now. And what we'd really like to see is that urgency, that desire to deliver in these areas come through in the National Strategy for Economic Transformation. If we do that, we might start to even consider that we're talking about good economics, because nature is our home, and if we don't manage it correctly, then we haven't got good economics. Our economics is not adding up, both in terms of those 4 pillars and in terms of addressing overall well-being. Just to end on a positive note, clearly we've got COP26 coming to Glasgow in a few weeks' time now. I think there is an opportunity that we can get things right. And just to finish on that kind of footballing analogy, there has been flashes in the pan, both in terms of men's and ladies football, where we have been really competing at the highest level and competing with the world's best. Well, unless we get this framework right, we're going to look pretty silly come COP26 to try and present ourselves as being global leaders when our framework clearly isn't there. With that, I'll stop and I'll hand back to Jimmy.
That was fantastic. Another compelling talk. Love the comparison to football. As a football person myself, would be great if we were all, yes sir, I can boogie after COP because we've got this right, you know. Let's find the equivalent song for us. In the interest of time, again, I won't summarize that, but God, that was fantastic. I will hand over to our 3rd speaker in this section, Craig DL, Head of Policy and Research at the Glasgow-based Think and Do Tank Commonweal, and co-author of their Common Home Plan, a fully costed Green New Deal for Scotland. Craig, really excited to hear from you.
Hi everyone, really glad to be here. I'm just going to try and share my screen, and I hope you can all see that. That's great. Yeah, I'm going to try and give you a 10-minute version of what is in that Common Home Plan and what a Green New Deal would actually mean if it was applied to Scotland, as well as the very specifically the tools that we already have to get started on that project. I mean, we know that we have to get moving. we know that the problem is on us now. In 2018, we had the IPCC report saying that there was no more time for debate and delay, and we had to do things now if we were going to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees C of our temperature rise. This year, they came out with a report saying, well, you're all delayed, now things are worse. The best case scenario is that we miss that 1.5 degree target, and the best case scenario is we only have a short overshoot. They also said every fraction of a degree matters, and the more we do now, the less damage we will have to put up with later. So there is a lot that Scotland can do. There is some stuff that Scotland cannot do at the moment within the current devolved framework. I'm not going to make too many presumptions about our audience's view on things like Scottish independence, but there are other solutions. Powers more. How did I end up unmuted? Sorry about that. Can you hear me now? Was I silent for that, for all of that?
No, just that last bit. You're okay.
I do apologise. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. Yeah, Scotland does need to transition away from oil. This is we know this. We've known this for years. It is an opportunity for the Scottish renewable industry. We've had folk like Friends of the Earth say that almost 5 times as many jobs could be developed in the offshore wind industry as in oil, and that's not including other offshore renewables like tidal or wave or whatnot. They've also said that skills are highly transferable. A lot, and we heard about this earlier in the conference, that a lot of people in the oil industry now could and want to move, but don't know how. So one of the things that we need to develop is that tool to allow that transition. One of the things that we do need to do in Scotland is and in the UK is reform our electrical grid. Our electrical grid was designed for an age when it was easy to move coal by train to where the power stations were. You can't do that with renewables so easily. Scotland specifically, though, this area is largely reserved. There isn't much that we can do in Scotland to affect this at the moment. However, the job of transitioning Scotland's current electrical grid to renewables is almost done. We're almost at 100% renewable electricity. However, this is dependent on us not increasing demand on that electrical grid. Right now, only about a quarter of Scotland's energy comes from is electrical based. We have about 25% of our energy needs in transport and about half in heating. So if we convert all of our vehicles to electric and all of our heating sectors to electric, and we don't do anything to reduce demand, suddenly we go from a country where almost all of our electricity is renewable to a country where we suddenly quadruple demand on that electricity, and the electrical grid cannot cope with that. So unless there is a transition there, we need to think about other ways of transitioning the rest of our energy use that we can do. The big one, as I mentioned, is heating. Right now, we're seeing a push for non-carbon heating in the form of electrical heating or air source heat pumps that, as I mentioned, would push up demand on our electricity grid. We think in our Common Home Plan, we should be pushing more for things like district heating. It's fairly common in the continent and not so common in the UK. Many advantages to this, not least this can be done via non-electrical means. It's much easier to future-proof, so if new technology comes along that makes heat generation cheaper, it can be easily plugged into a system. But it's something that does involve a lot of infrastructure planning. So the tool for change here is we do need to develop a national standard for district heating. We're starting to see that in the Scottish Government, although they quite frankly underestimate the scale of the challenge there. We need to start mapping where those district heating networks can go, and we need to start demanding that new building projects are either built with district heating or are at least district heating compatible so that they can be easily plugged into that system. as I said, a lot of our heating sources could come from non-electrical sources. Scotland could be largely heated by the sun. I mean that. We estimated that we could, after we've reduced a lot of our heating demand, we could heat much of Scotland through solar thermal panels. We can do geothermal in areas, especially in the central belt, where we've got a legacy of coal mining that has produced a lot of flooded coal mines from where geothermal heat can be extracted. And other technologies such as biogas, biomass, or hydrogen can be plugged into this system. So I would really like to see a system where we start to get our communities to scope out their own energy resources. What is the best energy sources for their local area? Are they on the banks of the Clyde, where the water there could be used to extract heat? Do they have a mine that they could extract geothermal for, or do they have a good area for an interseasonal heat store that could be used to extract solar thermal heat during the summer for use in the winter? Our biggest challenge is in housing, but it's also, at least part of it, is one of the simplest. For new housing, we're still building houses that are not meeting Green New Deal standards, even though we know that they need to be built to Green New Deal standards. Every house that we build now that isn't at that standard is a house that will need to be retrofitted before the end of its mortgage if it's going to meet Green New Deal standards by 2045. So something that I'd really love to see done right now is a recognition that we need to start building houses and other buildings at Green New Deal standard and reflect that in our building standards today. Nothing should be built today that isn't Green New Deal standard. However, we have 2.5 million houses in Scotland. Almost none of them are at Green New Deal standard, and 80% of them will still be standing in 2045. They all need to be retrofitted. Again, this is something where the Scottish Government, I don't think, fully grasps the scale of the challenge. There's the approaches to retrofitting revolves around using the Energy Performance Certificate standard, which actually we've shown is insufficient in itself. But the approach to it is to slowly ramp up the requirements for retrofitting, which might mean that people have to end up retrofitting their house 2, maybe 3 times over the next 25 years. What we're advocating is that we should have a national survey of all buildings to assess what is the maximum technically feasible retrofit that can be applied to that building. Can it reach full Green New Deal passive standards, or is there a reason that it can't? We need to develop a national procurement strategy to develop the supply chains to start producing and procuring the materials to retrofit these buildings. And we need to plan for mass retrofits, not just leaving it to individual house owners to do their house if and when they can. But we probably need to do this as a public service, probably at community level, possibly street by street refits rather than individual houses. We heard about farming a bit earlier in the conference today. Scotland could be at the forefront of pioneering new techniques in things like permaculture and agroecology. Right now, agricultural emissions are a major factor in our overall carbon budget, and not least also the fact that we import a lot of food, especially out of season food from sometimes halfway across the planet. We could be using our procurement rules to start to increase demand for local food. One of the big problems that we have in Scotland is that a local farmer might be able to produce enough fruit to service their local school, but the procurement rule says that they actually have to be able to produce enough fruit to service all of the schools in the local authority. If they can't do that, they can't bid for the contract at all. So we need to be looking at where those failures are to encourage local demand and shorten and make more resilient those supply chains. We also need to start training our farmers in more agroecological methods. So, and this is something that we probably need to be doing on the job, going out to farmers rather than taking them off the land for any extended period of time. I mentioned transport, and we have seen some good targets from the Scottish Government, such as trying to reduce car journeys by 20%. We could do that by everyone moving to a 4-day week. We could do that with hybrid working. We could do that with possibly virtual offices, where instead of having to commute halfway across the country to go to your office, you could go to a building in your community and walk there and log into your office from there. Because we do have to recognise that even though not every job can be worked from home, not every home can be worked from. I'm quite lucky in that I have a situation where I can work from home, even though there are limitations to that as well. This was actually a chapter of our Green New Deal plan that was difficult to write because we don't know what's going to happen with transport in the future. We don't know just how pervasive things like robot cars are going to be. So we're advocating that we should have a national public transport network. Public transport, if possible, should be free at the point of use. We don't know quite how much that's going to extend into things like robot taxis. The utopia version of that, everybody has a national public transport taxi that can come and pick them up when they need it. Dystopia version, we could end up with something like robot Uber or robot Google cars, a company that is probably vested interest in keeping as many cars on the road as possible, probably vested interest in keeping as many adverts in front of you as you're in your journey. So your traffic jam is now sponsored by Uber. The biggest change in the Green New Deal is going to come in the way we buy things. Right now, our entire economy and the growth-based aspects of that economy is buying more things than you did last time, constantly growing and throwing away, growing, buying more, throwing away. The stuff that we heard earlier on about the circular economy and circular economics and donut economics, it's all based on getting rid of that and having a much more regenerative attitude to our goods. Instead of buying and throwing away, instead of setting recycling targets even, we should be looking at nested loops of a circular economy where we're not buying, we're borrowing more, we're reusing more, we're repairing things more. One thing that the recent Climate Assembly called for was that all local authorities in Scotland should launch a network of resource libraries where you can borrow things like tools or clothes or toys or any number of things rather than having to buy things all the time. We also need much more in the way of producer responsibility, where producers are responsible for their products from creation right the way through to disposal. And that includes the packaging and other waste generated by the goods. The final tool that we really need to set is not just a final target. You know, we will be net zero by 2045 or whenever, but a firm roadmap, almost year by year roadmap that will take us there. Because one thing that we've learned from the Green New Deal and from the climate emergency is just because we've said we will have achieved the target by 2045, doesn't mean this is an excuse to wait until after the 2041 elections before we start thinking about doing stuff. I did say that the Green New Deal planning was costed, so just a very quick summary. We reckon it cost about £170 billion to over 25 years for Scotland to implement this. We reckon if we borrowed that money and paid it back over 50 years, it would cost about £5 billion a year. Newer estimates based on current interest rates actually pull that price down. It's probably closer to £4.5 billion a year now. But we do reckon that the Green New Deal would bring in about £6 billion a year in direct tax from job creation, plus revenue from nationalised industries. So the Green New Deal would actually pay for itself. Never mind the benefits in terms of the environment or health benefits because we're reducing pollution. It's almost nuts to not do it. So that's just a very, very brief taster. I'll stick a link in the chat where you can download the book and have a proper read yourself. And I'm happy to be involved in the discussion from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. That was fantastic. Please do put a link in the chat.